Right, so our steel industry is once more taking a clobbering as TATA Steel are set to make 2,800 people in Port Talbot in South Wales redundant. But what has made this story all the more angering this time around is that for years and years, TATA have threatened the government with closure of the Port Talbot plant, the lifeblood of Port Talbot for years, unless they've coughed up enough subsidies to keep the company going, and the Tories have duly obliged on repeated occasions over the last 14 years of their abhorrent reign in doing that. But with Labour having allowed the Indian conglomerate to buy the plant in 2007. Both are to blame therefore, but then New Labour were a bunch of Tories too, as is its reincarnation under Keir Starmer now. Starmer, of course, last year, you might remember, made a big thing about steel being made for warships by British Steel. And by that you might be thinking that we still have some semblance of a steel industry of our own. But actually British Steel, based in Scunthorpe, makes steel plate, do not make steel section at all for shipbuilding, and are actually owned by the Chinese. Our entire steel industry, which so many of our other industries rely on, our national defence relies on, is beholden to foreign corporations to make our steel for us. And as TATA are showing, that gives them a hell of a lot of leverage. The threat of packing up and leaving works to get more money out of the government to keep it going. It is a matter of national interest and national security that we renationalise our steel industry. We're a global laughingstock over this. And what makes the world laugh even harder is that be it Sunak or Starmer, they'll sell the industry again to another foreign body if they have to, if given the chance, because renationalisation is completely alien to the pair of them. Right, so let's start with a bit of context for our steel industry here, how we got into this mess, because it leads us into the situation our steel industry now finds itself in. Now, British Steel was one of many public assets, as so many of you will know, not nailed down, that the Tory government and Margaret Thatcher flogged off. And in the case of British Steel, this happened in 1988, by which point the industry, under government control, had doubled production since Thatcher came to power in 1979, was turning a profit, which, being a nationalised service, was cash to be sunk back into delivering an even better service in the national interest, and was costing us all less to produce. Naturally, the Tories felt shareholders should get that money instead of us benefiting from it, and therefore sold it, but all very sneakily, because what they did with British Steel, actually very similar to what they did with our water companies, and that was to basically change the British Steel Corporation, the nationalised industry, into British Steel PLC, a private company, and all assets, goods and chattels were then therefore transferred to this, and then along came the investors. The trouble with private companies is that they can be bought and sold though, and taken over, and come 1999, British Steel PLC ceased to exist, as it merged with a Dutch company, which I cannot pronounce and I'm not going to attempt to do. But once the merger went through, it all became the much more easy to pronounce Chorus Group. So now our steel industry was owned by Denmark in effect. Chorus then itself, however, got taken over in its entirety in 2007 by the Indian steel conglomerate TATA Steel, who have been in and out of the news a lot in recent years, chiefly for threatening to abandon its British sites unless the government stump up public cash to help them out. In 2016, TATA sold off its Scunthorpe site to investment company Greybull Capital, a British company. Therefore, we had a British private steel manufacturing base again, since Greybull are a British company, and this became called British Steel again. But then history, of course, repeats itself. Private company can be bought and sold. And this site was acquired by the Chinese Jingye Group in 2020, yet is still calling itself British Steel. So our steel industry is Indian and Chinese, neither of whom directly bought these sites from the British government. This is a situation that has been allowed to happen because of privatisation, because key infrastructure such as steel was just a cash cow to Thatcherites and capitalism. So now TATA are once again threatening jobs. The job cuts are coming in the worst way possible though, because it is actually the greening of the site that TATA are using to excuse the job cuts. At the end of this year, the 2 blast furnaces at Port Talbot will close, to be replaced by much less polluting electric arc furnaces costing an estimated £1.2 billion. They produce a lot less CO2, but they also require fewer workers to operate them. Big investment by TATA, you would think? Nope. They already threatened to close the entire plant unless we stump up half the cost to the public purse. So the Tories squealed like the little piggies that they are, and despite claiming to have no money for anything other than war these days, if you listen to them, TATA are actually getting £500 million towards the cost of this replacement. Not so long ago, TATA were threatening 5,000 job losses. So the government again stepped in with a funding package to safeguard these jobs. Will they end up having to stump up yet more cash yet again to save these 2,800 jobs? TATA have built a reputation of threatening jobs in this country to get money out of the government, when frankly the answer is quite simple. If they want to walk, let them. It'll be a damn sight cheaper at this point. Take the site back into public ownership, because when nationalised, it made a profit. TATA claimed it's a loss-making venture. Well, clearly they're just not very good at running it then. If they can't make it work, let someone else have a go. But when their boss trousered £1.6 million last year, a pay rise of a cool £700,000, I'm calling bullshit on them not making any money. Here's the thing though. The redundancies are unnecessary because trade unions got their heads together a while back and came up with a decarbonisation plan for the UK steel industry that would not require redundancies, and the likes of the GMB and Sharon Graham's Unite are asking, well, why are you not following our idea? To which I'd answer, look at the sheer amount of cash the government have thrown at TATA every time they threaten redundancies in order to keep the lie of privatisation going, and ask yourself, actually, in this situation here, who's really in charge? Because if our government had any spine, they would just renationalise at this point. They'd not let themselves be cucked like they clearly must be. They'd take control and they'd follow that plan while still greening the industry. But they've no spine. And besides, when it comes to any government of Rishi Sunak's, you always have to ask the question, is he benefiting financially himself here? Because it so often seems to be the case, doesn't it? TATA are an Indian company. Is Infosys involved here somewhere along the lines again? There are 32,000 people living in Port Talbot. 4,000 of them work at the steelworks. That's a full eighth of the population of Port Talbot. It is the biggest employer in the area by far. These redundancies, cutting the workforce by almost 3/4, will be catastrophic for the local economy there. It makes going green look bad, when that shouldn't be the crux of any argument against these plans. The fact is, TATA have repeatedly looked to downsize the staff required at this site. They can now do it. We, the general public, via these idiots we elect, abusing the public purse, because we need steel. By not renationalising, this is the leverage TATA knows it has. We need steel for building, railways, car manufacture, defence. Heck, from a national security position, it's a catastrophic prospect to not have steel. And we will be the only G20 country not actually able to produce its own steel, since these new arc furnaces will produce steel by recycling old steel. They won't actually be producing new steel from scratch at all. We will not be able to do that in this country whatsoever. All part of the downsizing and all part of the short-sightedness of the fools running the country. There's an obvious need for us to produce the high-quality British steel necessary for our infrastructure and other industries. Steel is a basic in this day and age in any productive, advanced nation. These job losses would not be necessary if they renationalised and invested in new steel manufacturing, which would save many of these jobs, which would pay for itself given how reliant on steel so many other industries are. But investing in this country just isn't something those obsessed with shrinking the state instead will do. Meanwhile, up in Scunthorpe, there are material concerns about its ability to continue, according to auditors, so British Steel in name once more might be about to bite the dust again too. Some are blaming Brexit for this. The former First Minister of Wales, Carwyn Jones, has said, in 2016 there was certainly a change in terms of the UK government's activity around TATA. Pre the Brexit referendum they were very active. Sajid Javid and I went to Mumbai. We talked to TATA. After the referendum, zero interest in the steel industry. And that, I'm afraid, has remained the case since. I think there's a lot of fallout from Brexit that we still don't realise or isn't necessarily being felt still in some of our everyday lives, certainly not affecting those of us not directly connected to the steel industry. But the knock-on effects can be felt eventually. Meanwhile, here's a tweet from Nigel Farage, because there's always one, isn't there? This one comes from 2016 when he said, if we vote to remain on June 23rd, it is the end of the steel industry in this country. Simple as that. We must leave the EU. Farage as ever with his finger on the pulse. I'm not sure I necessarily blame Brexit in and of itself here as much as I blame the government directly, though, because privatisation has been a pain for far longer than the effects of Brexit have been felt. Renationalisation of steel is the only way it is going to be saved. Neither the Tories nor Labour will do it. TATA, frankly, therefore, has got it made. If Starmer wasn't so reliant on other people telling him what to do, he could tell TATA, as the likely next PM, that they have a rethink or he's renationalising them. He's got a lot of leverage if he chose to deploy it. Instead, he will, no doubt, bend over backwards for them as well. Where steel conglomerates are rubbing their hands together with glee, so are private health investors, also in safe hands with Sunak and Starmer alike. But this is all a lot more sneaky, as they're doing away with doctors whilst making you think you'll still be seeing one, as this video here will explain all about. Another cost of privatisation. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so the US and UK attacks on those Houthi rebels, as our media love to call them, in Yemen. The implication being they are some kind of dissident people in the country, a militant group at odds with the rightful government of Yemen, and, well, there is certainly a dispute there. But if you thought nothing could unite the Houthis and the Presidential Leadership Council and the Southern Transitional Council, all these bodies within Yemen vying for power and control, then the country getting targeted by the US and UK for the actions of the Houthis blockading Israeli shipping just might have done it, as the Yemeni parliament in Sana'a have just passed a vote declaring the US and the UK to be global terrorist networks. Let's see how they like the issue being on the other foot for once. Right, so this truly does have the makings of a massive story potentially going forwards, making it all the more risible. It's hardly being touched at all. The details of which are still only now emerging though, so there's still time for mainstream sources to catch up. But even if they did, would they tell it like it is? Because this is not good news for the US and the UK. In what is a groundbreaking move, frankly, the Yemeni parliament has officially declared the governments of the United States and the United Kingdom as global terrorist networks under Yemeni law. There's no denying this has to be in part due to the escalating tensions between the US and the UK and Yemen after they bombed 10 locations in their country, killing several Houthis, and any denials that this has got anything to do with Israel and Gaza from the British government, as they have been trying to convince the world as is the case, hasn't cut through at all. We aren't that stupid, we aren't that daft. How silly do you think we are to think that the Houthi rebels interfering with Red Sea shipping heading to and from Israel has nothing to do with your attacks on them? Oh, but they're attacking the shipping of other countries as well, we're told. The spiv of a defence secretary still going by the name currently of Grant Shapps has said, when asked about fears this will destabilise the region even further, yes, I know the Houthis are saying that it's somehow connected, but actually 50 different nations have had their ships attacked, so it quite clearly isn't actually connected. They've just got into a routine of harassing any international shipping, so the two things are separate. Secondly, we're spending a huge amount of time, energy, visits, working with the governments throughout the region, throughout the Middle East, to say to them actually it is in no one's interest. And frankly, any of the governments are absolutely fed up to the teeth with the Houthis, with the Iranian-backed proxy there and elsewhere, who are really causing the instability in that region. He really is the political equivalent of a used car salesman, that one. 50 different nations, he said, having their shipping attacked by the Houthis, is it? Well, here's the thing, Shapsy. The Houthis didn't say they were only going to attack Israel's ships. It is any shipping going to and from Israel. It is an economic blockade of Israel. When one country sends a boatload of goods to Israel, this is called trade, Grant. The Houthis are interrupting that trade. So if someone is taking goods to Israel, no matter which country that might be in the world, if it's destined for Israel and it wants to go through the Red Sea, it's a target for the Houthis. So pretending just because many of these ships will be registered elsewhere, owned by other countries, is meaningless, when it is the intended recipient or recipient of Israeli goods going the other way, of course. That is the common denominator. Therefore, it is very much all about Israel. It is very much all about their genocide of Gaza right now. It is an economic sanction on Israel because of that. It is a blockade. And it would have been called off if Western-backed Israel, let's call them what they are, Western-backed Israel, was told by its Western backers to get out of Gaza and stop genociding the population. Instead, those Western backers, the US, the UK, decided to bomb Yemen instead to force them to stop their blockade. All this has done is get US and UK shipping added to the list of targets the Houthis now have, and has actually got all of Yemen united behind the Houthis in that, now labelling the US and the UK as terrorists. Invoking the Iranian boogeyman as being all behind it isn't going to wash either, because more and more this ongoing genocide is being seen as something the West could stop immediately if it pulled Israel up on its actions. Instead, it's had to go to court to try and do that. It chooses not to do that. The West chooses not to exert its influence on Israel. Its support for Israel is being undermined by the Houthis, however, so let's make it all about them now is very much Western-backed narrative, very much Grant Shapps' narrative and the Tory government. Let's excuse Israel by claiming it has nothing to do with them. It's a pack of lies, but then Shapps is a Tory, so we should expect nothing less. Yemen's case towards the US and UK isn't just predicated upon their attacks due to the Israel blockade either. This vote went through because of accusations of a lot more than just that. Accusations that are, in my opinion, completely justified as well. Another point that the Yemeni parliament has raised were the accusations against the US and the UK for financing terrorist networks within Yemen designed to keep the country destabilised. Yemen has been under some level or other of civil war since 2011. These three groups I mentioned earlier all vying for power, all claiming it in one area of the country or another. For example, the Yemeni government right now is supposedly led by the General People's Congress, that the largest political party. However, they've been in power since 2003. No elections for more than 20 years, therefore, after they got delayed, and then come civil war in 2011, still hasn't resolved this situation. The government's governance situation only worsening as a result. And since the Houthis took over the capital city of Sana'a in 2014, which is where Parliament is, controlling Parliament now as it therefore does, yet the deposed GPC president insists he's still in power. So there's that power conflict that hasn't been resolved within the Parliament itself at this point either, and certainly not in the capital. But it was this move by the Houthis that prompted Saudi Arabia to go to war with Yemen, of course. It was that 2014 taking of Sana'a that prompted Saudi Arabia to get involved, which of course had US and UK backing. Because that former government, that deposed president, was US and UK friendly, and the Houthis are not. 8 years of Saudi Arabia being armed heavily by us, as we know, we've been calling this out for years, much as we've been calling out the arms going to Israel more recently, have led to Yemen being completely destabilised, famine and poverty widespread in one of the poorest and most underdeveloped Arab nations on the planet. And risibly for the West, and indeed Western-backed Saudi Arabia, let's call them who they are as well, they failed. And the Houthis still control the capital. It's a massive embarrassment. One of the poorest, weakest, you would imagine, Arab nations on the planet, and the US and the UK, via Saudi Arabia, have been completely rinsed for years out there. So should we actually be very surprised, therefore, that they voted to mark the US and the UK as terrorist states? To those in control, they certainly are. Where actually they should be left to sort themselves out, because Western interference never helps. The state of Israel's very existence and how it came into existence is proof of that. But worse, our military interference and the track record that has shows that the West cannot win in a fight against Yemen. Try as we might, it proves we haven't won. We cannot win out there. Afghanistan proved the same thing. 20 years we were out there fighting the Taliban, only to hand it straight back to the Taliban. It might be a poor country, Yemen, in and of itself, but it does have those Iranian backers the press keep reminding us of course. They've also become involved more overtly, and any fight against Yemen will involve Iran either in support or overtly this time around at that. All of this is happening around one of the most important sea trade routes on the planet, which is getting cut off to more and more shipping the more volatile things become. Never mind the Houthis targeting and who they're targeting. The volatility of the situation is going to make shipping more hazardous. But because nobody wants to sail through a war zone, of course. And the Houthis know it. Geography is proving to be their biggest asset right now against any force who comes up against them, the US, UK, or whoever it is. And there's talk of them now taking control of even more of the waterways in the Middle East, and a plan being labelled the Al-Aqsa Triangle, which consists of taking control of all three of the main waterways in the Middle East, which conceivably they could do. The Houthis are already making the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the south of the Red Sea impassable. Iran has recently seized a US-linked tanker in the Persian Gulf. They could control that waterway, at the narrow Strait of Hormuz, which connects the Persian Gulf to the Indian Ocean. And the third waterway is the Suez Canal itself, at the north of the Red Sea. If they were to pull this off, that'd be all the oil and gas from the Middle East cut off from the world, potentially, but most importantly, as far as the Houthis and their Iranian support are concerned, cut off completely from Israel. That would be a huge escalation. The US and the UK have done absolutely nothing to help this situation and to ease it. They've worsened it. And the justification Yemen has used in acting to proscribe the US and the UK as they have now is because they are quite justifiably seen as prolonging the situation in Gaza. As for the rest of the world, global news outlet Trends Newsline have said, the international community has taken note of the Yemeni parliament's declaration, with many countries expressing concern over the escalating tensions in the region. There are fears that this latest development could further destabilise an already volatile situation and hinder efforts to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict. As the situation continues to unfold, it is clear that Yemeni parliament's declaration will have far-reaching implications for diplomatic relations between Yemen, the US and the UK. It remains to be seen how these nations will respond to the accusations and whether they will take any concrete actions to address the concerns raised by the Yemeni parliament. I won't hold my breath. Not when Yemen and Iran are to blame for everything in the eyes of the West, and they continue to make excuses for Israel at every turn as they continue their genocide. Something's got to give, but if the US and the UK continue down the road they are right now with regards to Israel and Yemen, things are only going to get worse in a fight they can't win. Down tools, end the genocide, permanent ceasefire imposed in Israel and Gaza, open diplomatic relations with all these nations involved to get this situation dealt with. It's obvious what we need to see, and it always comes down to diplomacy. But I've got no faith that's where Western governments are going to go right now. Things especially won't change with a change of UK government, as Labour's Keir Starmer flips from the right of Palestinians to a state of their own, to abolishing Labour's commitment to a Palestinian state, to back again, his opinion swinging one way or the other with voting intention. This fickle creature's flip-flopping is all laid out in this video here. He's making more U-turns than Israeli shipping in the Red Sea. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so once again, US and UK forces have attacked Yemen. Allegedly 8 more targets struck, once more in a bid to stop the Red Sea attacks the Houthis have been making. Sorry, Iran-backed Houthis, as the media keep calling them. Let's not forget to remind everyone who is funding the attacks on Israeli shipping in the Red Sea. But equally, we should also not forget that that shipping isn't just Israeli, but any country delivering cargo to and from Israel as well. So that the next time a politician pops up and bleats about 50 different countries having their ships attacked, they should perhaps provide some context about where those ships were coming or going from, because you'll probably find it's Israel. We also need to always remember why the Houthis are doing this, because they're trying to bring about the end of the genocide in Gaza, which also puts the attacks on them into perspective, because if you are attacking Yemen right now, you're doing it to defend that genocide. Western-backed Israel, Houthi-supported Gaza, Iran-backed Yemen. Our media is woeful at providing all of the right context, just some of it. But ultimately, the war on Yemen is futile. They've made history. They've invented an entirely new method of naval blockade, where they don't even need their own navy, and where everything they are throwing at some of the most powerful naval forces in the world are at a fraction of the cost of that which their opponents are returning fire with. You can blow up this Yemen target or another. They'll just set up somewhere else at next to no cost at all. There is no win here when their actions are as clever as they are cheap to enact. The only way to end the blockade of Israeli shipping, and of course US and UK shipping now as well, is to end the siege of Gaza. Right, so Yemen has been hit again in another night of strikes by the now Yemeni proclaimed global terrorist networks of the US and the UK, along with those nations assisting them: Canada, Australia, Bahrain and Holland. 8 targets were hit, apparently striking missile launchers, air defence systems, radar. Even the capital city of Sana'a was hit, it being under Houthi control since 2014. Just like last time though, it won't make the blindest bit of difference to the Houthis. They will carry on doing what they're doing. It's what they do. Defeat isn't an option for them. They aren't wired up that way. They've beaten the US before because it's too tough a geography to fight with, too tough a terrain to combat. They've held off Saudi Arabia, their own neighbours, for 8 years as well. And this country is one of the poorest and most impoverished on the planet, and they've still done that. Which makes targeting them all the more pathetic as well, and even more so when, despite their poverty, they're still willing to stand up and be counted to help a state less fortunate their own, which Palestine absolutely qualifies as. And the reason they will hold out and carry on and inflict more embarrassment and defeat on Western powers, through the futility of their actions as Yemen will keep on demonstrating, is that they've come up with an entirely new form of warfare. And that's been spelt out by an Irish economist of all people called Philip Pilkington. He explained it like this. A massive historical shift has just taken place because up until December of last year, so just 6 weeks ago, if you wanted to enact a naval blockade, in human history from Roman times to the age of sail right up to 1995, if you wanted to enact a naval blockade, you needed a navy, a deep sea navy. And in order to have a navy, the navy is the most expensive component of the army. It's extremely expensive to maintain a navy. I think Britain knows how expensive it is to maintain a navy. So you need a massive GDP, and then you need the commitment to put that portion of the GDP on the table to build a big navy. At that point, you get to play with the big boys and threaten or enact a naval blockade. Well, the Houthis have just gone and enacted a naval blockade, and they've done so with cheap technology. Not low technology, cheap technology. It's not that they're using low-tech products, it's that high-tech products have become commodified and cheap, and they're able to enact a naval blockade. That's a first in human history. That's never, ever, ever been able to be done before. And the consequences of it are absolutely enormous. I think much broader, that technological shift, that proof is much, much bigger in a sense than anything that will actually happen in the Middle East. There's a delicious irony here that capitalism, the commodification of anything and everything, as we've seen for decades now, Thatcherism as it's known as in this country, driven by the West, enriching the West, because it's not just unique to the UK, is now getting used by the Middle East against the West. A nation whose navy consists of speedboats and dinghies, enacting a blockade not only on cargo vessels, but also military warships, as we've seen them do, to their cost admittedly as well. Attacks on vessels by the Houthis, notably against the US and UK, who got themselves added to their shipping target list after the first attack, are no longer limited to the Red Sea either, because to get to the Red Sea, shipping must travel along Yemen's south coast through the Gulf of Aden, itself no wider in any practical sense than the Red Sea is. A military supply vessel of the US called the Ocean Jazz has been targeted in the Gulf of Aden, en route with more missiles to US warships further along the line. Of course, the West is attempting to justify its actions still, again this time around as well, with the same excuses they made before, that this has nothing to do with Israel. It is just the Houthis threatening shipping in the Red Sea, and they are picking targets at random, just making nuisances of themselves. Our unelected Foreign Secretary, old ham-face himself, David Cameron, has been snarling through his thin lips about this again in light of this latest attack on Yemen, saying, "What the Houthis are doing is unacceptable. It's illegal and is threatening the freedom of navigation. That's why we've taken the action. Alongside that action is a whole set of measures we'll be taking, including sanctions and other pressure to put on the Houthis. Combined, of course, with the actions of our Royal Navy is taking with others in the Red Sea, and we will be building the strongest coalition of support to back the steps that we've been taking." As full of crap today as he always has been. The Navy, as aforementioned, if making futile attempts to break this blockade, any sanctions that may be imposed, Iran will most likely mitigate. And if you want to talk about illegal, how about arming a nation committing genocide still, and your leader, Rishi Sunak, shaking hands with the maniac overseeing that and saying he hopes he wins? A case for aiding and abetting genocide is being built against this country now by South Africa, and you come out with pomposity about maintaining global shipping as your driving interest? Well, it might well be part of it now. Our own economy will be affected, but that's your idiocy for getting us involved militarily in this. Besides, it's a lie. To believe Cameron's rhetoric about the shipping, you'd think the Red Sea was a ghost town right now. And it isn't. And you can check that for yourself, just as I've done here.
Right, so this is taken from a website called marinetraffic.com, which shows all marine traffic travelling around the world at any one point in time, and it updates live, and you can check it for yourself. And if we have a look at the Red Sea here and the Gulf of Aden, you can very much see shipping traffic is very much flowing along the Gulf of Aden, up through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait just there, up through into the Red Sea, and traffic is moving in both directions. Depending on the colour of the arrow, tells you what sort of vessel it is. The green ones there are cargo vessels, and the little red ones there are tankers, and as I said, depending on which way the arrow is pointing, depends which direction the ship happens to be sailing at this particular point in time. And shipping is very much still moving, contrary to what David Cameron is telling us. If we go up into the north of the Red Sea, you can see shipping entering towards the Suez Canal here, and the Suez Canal is extremely busy, as you can tell, as it normally is. And if we zoom in towards the Gulf of Aqaba and we go and have a look at Israel and the port of Eilat, which is being blockaded, there's very little going on there, is there? What shipping is there at the top of the Gulf of Aqaba is docking in Aqaba itself, which is Jordan. So shipping travelling up here is Jordanian. Israel is being blockaded brilliantly efficiently by the Houthis in Yemen, and there's very, very little anyone can do about it.
Do check marineshipping.com for yourself. You will see a very busy Red Sea. As has been repeatedly said, the Houthis really are only targeting specific shipping. The very shipping they've said they're targeting in order to bring about a ceasefire in Gaza. The attacks on them are pathetic. The only deaths that have occurred in the Red Sea have been courtesy of Western actions. The Houthis themselves have killed nobody. The only thing they are killing is Western trade, along with that of Israel, and that really is the only reason we're there. So there is zero reason to support this pathetic posturing by our government. It's only going to embolden Iran, who are backing those Houthis. You'll never get a chance to forget it. The mainstream media will keep reminding you they've recently grabbed hold of a US-linked oil tanker, no less. Will more oil and gas traffic trying to come and go via the Persian Gulf be liable to be seized next as well? Keep an eye on that. Watch this video next to learn more about this incident as well, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so the use of so-called Hannibal directives in the ongoing Israel-Gaza situation since the night of October 7th has been a story the mainstream have not covered particularly well. They have avoided it in a large part. There have been numerous stories in alternative media covering these appalling rules, which purportedly were scrapped in 2016, but which even Israeli relatives of current Hamas hostages are now increasingly saying are being enacted. Hannibal directives are instructions to Israeli military to kill their own people rather than allow them to be taken hostage. The mere fact growing substantial evidence and testimonies that they are still being used should be significant cause for alarm. But equally, this lends more weight to the fact that the government of Netanyahu are not really trying to rescue hostages. And in fact, as the 3 Israeli hostages who came out waving a white flag only to be shot by the IDF shows, they are clearly perfectly acceptable collateral damage, especially in light of news of yet another incident of Israelis killing their own people in Gaza rather than try to rescue them has come out. This one is possibly even more blatant. Right, so the killing of 3 Israeli hostages by the IDF the other week has been one of the starkest examples of what an absolute rabble the supposedly most moral army in the world is. If shoot first, ask questions later is their attitude, it is no wonder they are regarded as inept by various military spokespeople around the world, and it is also no wonder that so many Israelis fear for the lives of their family members being held by Hamas. Not for how they'll be treated, but in case the Israeli forces kill them in their indiscriminate actions in Gaza. Sadly, another example of this may have just come up, and this time family members have broken into the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, to demand answers of Netanyahu and his far-right regime, who are supposed to be trying to rescue these, say they are trying to rescue them, yet whose actions simply imply they don't care one iota. So this latest incident is initially centred around claims made by the mother of one of 3 hostages killed in a Hamas tunnel. The 3 hostages in question consisted of 2 soldiers, Ron Sherman and Nick Beiser, along with a civilian named Elias Toledano. Mayanne Sherman, the mother of Ron, has spoken out on the incident on Facebook, and she wrote, "We were told that there is a reasonable possibility that he inhaled toxic gases from the IDF bomb." Of course, this is the trouble with indiscriminate carpet bombing, isn't it? What possible care can you possibly take not to hit your own hostages when you can't ever be sure where they are? The actions of Israel, both documented on October 7th when they blew up civilian buildings with tanks and cut down people fleeing a music festival with Apache gunships, to shooting their own hostages without bothering to check if they were your own people. One of those people was white and ginger. You don't find many Hamas operatives fitting that description. Plus all the reports of Hannibal directives. Israel are not acting in a way in Gaza that shows any real intent of rescuing their own people. More, they're being used as an excuse to enact the genocide that they are, and should they die, well, we'll just blame Hamas for that as well. Israel's position on these latest 3 deaths, though, are one of claiming not to know what happened. The official IDF statement states, "At this stage, it cannot be denied nor confirmed that they were killed due to strangulation, suffocation, poisoning, or as the result of an IDF attack or Hamas operation." The Israeli army also claimed they didn't know the hostages were there, which does seem plausible, as I've said. When you're just destroying everything, not caring what you hit, be it a Hamas tunnel or a school or a church or a refugee camp, hostages, of course, could be held anywhere. Some are certainly bound to be killed by friendly fire. I hate that phrase, but it's true. Certainly a truer statement than the Israeli one. Mayan Sherman has called their statement out as well as their denial of knowing where the hostages were in this instance. She claims that Army Major General Rassan Allen told her they knew where her son was. She's prepared to name names. That's not insignificant, is it? Especially when it's her own side she's calling out here. She's called it another lie in the mask of lies, which really does condemn her own government and their military forces. A mother's wrath and all of that, and who can blame her? She's not alone in demanding answers now, though. The 3 victims of alleged Israeli fire died in mid-December, so over a month ago now. Denial isn't just a river in Egypt, and Israel is still proving that, to the point one of Israel's own newspapers has now joined in with Marianne Sherman in demanding answers over this incident just yesterday. The liberal Israeli paper Haaretz, Netanyahu hates them so much he's threatened to shut them down, but still they hold him to account. And they've now waded in as well, because finally the Israeli state has released to the families of the 3 killed hostages the pathology report and a report on how the bodies were found, but without specifying if the army used poison gas. Following the release of these reports, Marianne Sherman again took to Facebook, and she said this time, "The inquiry's findings. Ron was indeed murdered. Not by Hamas, not by stray bullets, and not in an exchange of fire. This was deliberate murder, bombing with poison gas. Oh yes, they found that Ron also had several crushed fingers, apparently due to his desperate attempts to escape the poison grave." There's something about Israel, a Jewish state, as it constantly reminds us that it is, with their history, using poison gas that makes me feel very uncomfortable. I put myself in their shoes and I think to myself, of all the weaponry that could be used, would that be one I would select? And I just hate the thought of it. For Haaretz's part here, they've said, all these questions must be investigated by an outside body, one that will receive all the necessary information from the army and the government and present its conclusions to the public. We cannot wait until after the war ends to carry out this vital investigation. An outside body coming in to investigate potential Israeli crimes when they're still committing genocide, I just can't see them allowing that, can you? You're interrupting our genocide, back off! And now more relatives have decided more proactive action is required to get Netanyahu to realise their family members are Israeli citizens, are people, and not just numbers or bargaining chips. A meeting of the Knesset's Finance Committee got invaded by relatives of hostages yesterday, accusing Netanyahu's government of ignoring their family's plight and holding up placards saying, "You won't sit here while they are dying there." Who can blame them when Netanyahu last week unilaterally binned an agreed upon position with his own cabinet to negotiate with Hamas for another round of hostage releases? He just changed his mind. He's now got relatives permanently camped out on his own front lawn who have sworn to remain there until a deal is reached to bring the rest of the 130 hostages Hamas are still holding home. Israel, of course, hold far more hostages than Hamas have. They keep them in prison. They arrest them over stupid things if they arrest them for any particular reason at all. So Hamas are demanding not only another large release of Israeli-held hostages, but also an end to the genocide full stop. It is all well within the power of Netanyahu to do this, but he still rabidly refuses shows what a danger he is, not just to the people of Gaza, but his own Israeli citizens too. He won't do it because it is all he's got to stay in power, as well as stay out of court. I think this is something that is easily forgotten in the face of Gaza getting razed to the ground and the sheer number of deaths happening there, because fundamentally Netanyahu is as indifferent to them as he is his own people. It wouldn't surprise me if he blamed them for getting captured, that more and more of the losses on the Israeli side are being blamed on Israel by these victims, Israeli families, shows that Netanyahu's regime isn't just a threat to Palestine, but a threat to Israel itself too. And when Western states are lending their support to Israel, it is actually his regime they are supporting here. The attacks on Yemen, the flights from RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus by US and UK military aircraft doing goodness knows what, the warships we've sent, the weaponry and military equipment we sell to Israel. Yemen aren't actually wrong to describe us as part of a global terrorist network in all of this, are they? You should watch this video next to find out all about that one, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so there was definitely a sense of the International Court of Justice being on trial since South Africa brought its genocide case against Israel, because if it should not have found, at least in part, against Israel after their embarrassingly poor defence at The Hague versus a cut and polished South African prosecution, then international law would have been pronounced a sham. It would have been over. In that, I suppose the court has absolved itself in what it has decided to do today. The interim orders it has handed down to Israel, as well as what it is going to do going forwards, they're definitely a spanking for Israel. And of course the orders handed down are very much legally binding as well. But do they go far enough? And will it ultimately make any difference to what Israel are doing now, and how this genocide, as we can very much all call it now, may be shaped by it going forwards? Right, so has Israel been ordered to cease fire immediately and get out of Gaza then? No. That said, though, South Africa is still delighted by the result they've got, because the International Court of Justice has ruled that there is a prima facie case that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. Prima facie simply meaning at first sight. So this interim judgment is based on first impressions, therefore based entirely, as you would imagine it would be at this stage of the game, on the case South Africa presented to the court. The ICJ President, Judge Joan Donohoe, spoke for some 40 minutes in giving the court's ruling, and it was 40 minutes of her essentially spanking Israel from one end of the courtroom to the other, though obviously done in legalese. In order to ascertain whether any preliminary measures could be taken and provisional orders made against Israel, it was crucial that South Africa proved prima facie, and this is simply made on the basis of the merits of the case as presented by the South African prosecution. It is too early to decide if actual violations of the Genocide Convention have been committed by Israel, no matter how blatant much of what we've read or seen in clips of on social media might say, might indicate to ourselves, might form our own opinions. The main case will take considerably longer to reach a conclusion over, possibly years even, such as the importance placed on meeting this requirement so that the ICJ has, within its jurisdiction, the ability to place any interim orders it might decide to, and these would then have the necessary legal weight. So prima facie is incredibly important. It means that these orders they put down will be legally binding. And these came at the end, and were read out by the President of the Court, Joan Donohoe, thusly. The Court indicates the following provisional measures. 1. By 15 votes to 2, the State of Israel shall, in accordance with its obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, in relation to Palestinians in Gaza, take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of Article 2 of this Convention. In particular, A. Killing members of the group. By group they're obviously referring to the Gazans. B. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. 2. By 15 votes to 2, the State of Israel shall ensure with immediate effect that its military does not commit any acts described in point 1 above. 3. By 16 votes to 1, the State of Israel shall take all measures within its power to prevent and punish the direct and public incitement to commit genocide in relation to members of the Palestinian group in the Gaza Strip. 4. By 16 votes to 1, the State of Israel shall take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. 5. By 15 votes to 2, the State of Israel shall take effective measures to prevent the destruction and ensure the preservation of evidence related to allegations of acts within the scope of Article 2 and Article 3 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crimes of Genocide against members of the Palestinian group in the Gaza Strip. And 6. By 15 votes to 2, the State of Israel shall submit a report to the court on all measures taken to give effect to this order within 1 month as from the date of this order. Now, it has to be said that people who were postulating how the judges would vote, especially given Judge Donahoe is herself American, another judge, Judge Nolte, is German. Both nations are backing Israel strongly right now. So the 8 votes required by members of the ICJ, 9 if you include the representative judges from both Israel and South Africa, was seen as far from certain. The fact that out of the 17 judges, all of the interim orders were voted on by at least 15 or 16 votes really does go to show how big a thrashing Israel got at this point, far bigger than anyone was predicting. Or to look at it another way, how strong the South African case actually was. In case you're assuming the judge who voted against each order was the Israeli one, you'd also be wrong. The Israeli judge actually voted against his own country twice, against his own government, the government of Netanyahu, on orders 3 and 4. The judge who voted against every single order was Judge Julius Sabatinde from Uganda. What the hell, Uganda? What's this about? Ugh, questions for another day, that one. However, there was no call for a ceasefire as South Africa had wanted, and no call for Israel to withdraw from Gaza, so the war, for lack of another suitable word at this point, can go on, as long as it isn't in violation of these orders. This won't go far enough for many. They want this to end. We all want it to end. We all hoped there would be a ceasefire. There's little reason to believe Israel will do anything any different. Netanyahu has already stated in past few days he'd ignore any orders. But does that mean the rest of the world will? These interim orders are legally binding after all. The ICJ might not have any army at its disposal to enforce the ruling it has laid down, but it is a branch of the United Nations, along with the UN General Assembly, the UN Security Council, and every nation signed up to the Genocide Convention that this prosecution was brought under. Turning a blind eye just isn't acceptable. Not now a legal ruling on Israel's conduct in Gaza has been put in place. This is a win, even if it isn't the big win that we all wanted to see. These are the first steps in accountability we've seen slapped on Israel ever in the 75 years of its existence, the 56 years of its occupation of Palestine. That matters. That counts for something. The ICJ has ordered Israel to take measures to prevent genocide in Gaza and report back to the court in 1 month detailing how they've done that. If they don't bother, as Netanyahu's rhetoric would appear to imply, or if they aren't seen to have done enough, then that ceasefire is, well, it's still in the ICJ's back pocket. Even as the judgment was being read out, bombing was going on in Gaza. So really, I suppose that begs the question, what has changed, or what will actually change? Well, for one, by acknowledging prima facie, the crime of genocide has been established on first glance. Therefore, the ICJ will take the case forward. This isn't the end of it. It's just the beginning. There is now a sense of Israel being held to account. A ruling on genocide has just gone against them. More could follow. Therefore, all the excuses Israel always make, and will in some quarters no doubt still make, will no longer wash. They'll be even weaker an argument than ever. A precedent has now been set, met, and ruled on. If the anti-Semitism card gets played again, for instance, there's now a legal ruling people can use to push back and refute that. South Africa are delighted, as I've said. In attendance at The Hague was South Africa's Foreign Minister, Naledi Pandora, who spoke of how welcoming the issuing of the emergency orders has been in her country, and that in her view, the orders handed down by the court would have to amount to a ceasefire, since there is no way that Israel can carry on indiscriminately bombing the Gaza Strip as they have been doing for months. And with prima facie satisfied for Israel to not change tactics, not stop its carpet bombing, its destruction of infrastructure, it would be in violation of the court. Attacks on Gaza, as have been seen, cannot continue, so would have to be a ceasefire from civilian perspective, surely. However, this does assume goodwill and willingness on the part of Israel, however, which few, I think, would grant them. But the order handed down to Israel here also affects every other country that has sided with them and aids them in any way. If Israel carry on as they have been, don't change their ways at all, and the US and UK, for example, keep supplying arms to them, well, they're going to end up being in trouble themselves. Individuals, whoever they are, wherever they're from, involved in continuing this genocide in any way, now that this order has been laid down, can find themselves faced with an arrest warrant now. This is particularly problematic for the US. They, as we know, just like here in the UK, have refused to call for a ceasefire, but have been calling for mass bombardment to end. Now, the ICJ has made that a legal ruling, enforcing exactly what the US says it wants. Therefore, should matters pertaining to the enforcement of this order come before the UN Security Council, for whom it would be down to enforcement, the US using their veto in any way contrary to the ICJ ruling, well, that would not only be illegal now, but would also be complete hypocrisy, and Biden would deserve the arrest warrant that would be delivered to the door of the White House, wouldn't he? This also puts just as much pressure on our government, who keep going along with whatever the US do, as well as the Labour Party of Keir Starmer, who are also in complete lockstep on this. Israel now have a month to stop killing civilians deliberately, to restore infrastructure and allow in aid, and prove they're doing this. Otherwise, more orders may follow. The fear is Israel don't stop and the killing goes on for another 4 weeks, as it has done all along, for months now. But now each and every incident of needless civilian death, of destruction of aid or services that we see on social media, that gets reported in Middle Eastern media, for example, Al Jazeera, as a for instance, is a violation of this court ruling, is illegal in the World Court. We are all our own media these days, aren't we? We've all got smartphones, we've all got access to the internet, especially these people in Palestine and Gaza. These matters can and will be collected and collated, and if Israel don't stop, well, it's now been proven that they can and will be taken to task for what they do. Ball's in their court. If I were them, I'd just quit whilst I was behind. I wonder how the Houthis in Yemen will take this news. Is it enough for them to stop blockading ships, or will they wait a little bit longer to see if Israel do actually do as they're told? Either way, their actions have just made history, and this video here will show you exactly how, if you care to watch it next, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so it's a somewhat obvious oversight in journalistic coverage of the events of October 7th that nobody had bothered to actually ask Hamas why they did what they did. Well, nobody condones the violence they may have shown on the night of October 7th. So many narratives have been weaved in order to, at least at first, justify the Israeli response, before it became crystal clear it wasn't proportionate. It was genocide that was being carried out instead. In light of that, you'd think perhaps somebody might try and, talk to Hamas, get their side of the story, interview them about their actions, their plans and their intentions, but no. Not a hope. Not from our media. In fact, Hamas have released a statement. But that's too much like effort to pay attention to as well, it would seem. In fact, for this statement to come to my attention, it's come from a Palestinian academic in the West Bank to a Palestinian activist in this country, who then took it to a renowned independent news site. So it seems only right that their side of the story should be told as widely as possible, so people can make as informed an opinion having both sides of the story. And whether you're pro-Israel or pro-Palestine, or frankly are just pro-peace and want an end to all of this atrocity, you can't argue with the need to hear from all concerned, surely, can you? Right, so there is a Hamas statement on what happened on October 7th, and having heard from large swathes of the media what Israel has said about the events of that night versus what has been discovered following some investigation, perhaps the Hamas version of events is well overdue being heard. What a pity none of our media have ever seemed interested. Fortunately, those with an interest in getting this point of view heard have worked to achieve this. A briefing provided by Hamas has been passed along to the UK by the Palestinian academic Professor Mazin Kumsieh, who teaches at Bethlehem University in the West Bank and also runs the Palestinian Museum of Natural History. Now, having passed this briefing on to a Palestinian rights activist in the UK, Flavio Centofanti, they have in turn passed it on to Squawkbox, who have reproduced the briefing in full in what is a UK exclusive, sad to say, when surely journalism is about exposing the truth, and that requires viewpoints from both sides of these atrocities in order to ascertain. No other media are bothered with this. No other media have picked this up. It is impossible for large big budget mainstream news sources to not be aware of this briefing being in existence. So what gives, guys? If you aren't covering something as important as a key piece to this story, like the version of events of one of the actual parties involved, then what are you doing? Shaping a narrative, telling us what to think instead, clearly. It's the only conclusions you can reach. We've learned a lot in the 3 months since October 7th. See if this 10-point response from Hamas and any of the contents thereof ring any bells with you, and use it to formulate your own opinion. This is what it says. In light of the Israeli fabricated accusations and allegations over Operation Al-Aqsa Flood on October 7th and its repercussions, we in the Islamic Resistance Movement, Hamas, clarify the following. 1. Operation Al-Aqsa Flood on October 7th targeted the Israeli military sites and sought to arrest the enemy's soldiers to pressure on the Israeli authorities to release the thousands of Palestinians held in Israeli jails through a prisoner exchange deal. Therefore, the operation focused on destroying the Israeli army's Gaza division, the Israeli military sites stationed around the Israeli settlements around Gaza. 2. Avoiding harm to civilians, especially children, women and elderly people, is a religious and moral commitment by all the Al-Qassam Brigade's fighters. We reiterate that the Palestinian resistance was fully disciplined and committed to the Islamic values during the operation, and that the Palestinian fighters only targeted the occupation soldiers and those who carried weapons against our people. In the meantime, the Palestinian fighters were keen to avoid harming civilians, despite the fact that the resistance does not possess precise weapons. In addition, if there was any case of targeting civilians, it happened accidentally and in the course of the confrontation with the occupation forces. Since its establishment in 1987, the Hamas movement committed itself to avoiding harm to civilians. After Zionist criminal Baruch Goldstein in 1994 committed a massacre against Palestinian worshippers in the Al-Ibrahimi Mosque in occupied Hebron city, the Hamas movement announced an initiative to avoid civilians, the brunt of fighting by all parties, but the Israeli occupation rejected it and even did not give any comment on it. The Hamas movement also repeated such calls several times, but received by a deaf ear from the Israeli occupation, which continued its deliberate targeting and killing of Palestinian civilians. 3. Maybe some faults happened during Operation Al-Aqsa Flood's implementation due to the rapid collapse of the Israeli security and military system and the chaos caused along the border areas with Gaza. As attested by many, the Hamas movement dealt in a positive and kind manner with all civilians who have been held in Gaza and sought from the earliest days of the aggression to release them. And that's what happened during the week-long humanitarian truce, where these civilians were released in exchange of releasing Palestinian women and children from Israeli jails. 4. What the Israeli occupation promoted of allegations that the Al-Qassam brigades on October 7th were targeting Israeli civilians are nothing but complete lies and fabrications. The source of these allegations is the Israeli official narrative, and no independent source proved any of them. It is a well-known fact that the Israeli official narrative had always sought to demonize the Palestinian resistance, while also legalizing its brutal aggression on Gaza. Here are some details that go against the Israeli allegations. Video clips taken on that day, October 7th, along with the testimonies by Israelis themselves that were released later, showed that the Al-Qassam Brigade's fighters didn't target civilians, and many Israelis were killed by the Israeli army and police due to their confusion. It has also been firmly refuted the lie of the 40 beheaded babies by the Palestinian fighters, and even Israeli sources denied this lie. Many of the Western media agencies unfortunately adopted this allegation and promoted it. The suggestion that the Palestinian fighters committed rape against Israeli women was fully denied, including by the Hamas movement. A report by the Mondo Weiss news website on December 1st, 2023, amongst others, said there is a lack of any evidence of mass rape allegedly perpetrated by Hamas members on October 7th, and that Israel used such allegation to fuel the genocide in Gaza. According to 2 reports by the Israeli Yedioth Aharonoth newspaper on October 10th and the Haaretz newspaper on November 18th, many Israeli civilians were killed by an Israeli military helicopter, especially those who were in the Nova Music Festival near Gaza, where 364 Israeli civilians were killed. The 2 reports said the Hamas fighters reached the area of the festival without any prior knowledge of the festival, where the Israeli helicopter opened fire on both the Hamas fighters and the participants in the festival. The Yedioth Aharonoth also said the Israeli army, to prevent further infiltrations from Gaza and to prevent any Israelis being arrested by the Palestinian fighters, struck over 300 targets in areas surrounding the Gaza Strip. Other Israeli testimonies confirmed that the Israeli army raids and soldiers' operations killed many Israeli captives and their captors. The Israeli occupation army bombed the houses in the Israeli settlements where Palestinian fighters and Israelis were inside in a clear application of the Israeli army notorious Hannibal directive, which clearly says that better a dead civilian hostage or soldier than taken alive, to avoid engaging in a prisoner swap with the Palestinian resistance. Furthermore, the occupation authorities revised the number of their killed soldiers and civilians from 1,400 to 1,200 after finding that 200 burnt corpses had belonged to the Palestinian fighters who were killed and mixed with Israeli corpses. This means that the one who killed the fighters is the one who killed the Israelis, knowing that only the Israeli army possesses military planes that killed, burned and destroyed Israeli areas on October 7th. The Israeli heavy aerial raids across Gaza that led to the death of nearly 60 Israeli captives also prove that the Israeli occupation does not care about the life of their captives in Gaza. 5. It is also a matter of fact that a number of Israeli settlers in settlements around Gaza were armed and clashes with Palestinian fighters on October 7th. Those settlers were registered as civilians, while the fact is they were armed men fighting alongside the Israeli army. 6. When speaking about Israeli civilians, it must be known that conscription applies to all Israelis above the age of 18. Males who serve 32 months of military service and females who serve 24 months, where all can carry and use arms. This is based on the Israeli security theory of an armed people, which turned the Israeli entity into an army with a country attached. 7. The brutal killing of civilians is a systematic approach of the Israeli entity, and one of the means to humiliate the Palestinian people. The mass killing of Palestinians in Gaza is a clear evidence of such approach. 8. The Al Jazeera news channel said in a documentary that in 1 month of the Israeli aggression on Gaza, the daily average killing of Palestinian children in Gaza was 136, while the average of children killing in Ukraine in the course of the Russian-Ukrainian war was 1 child every day. 9. Those who defend the Israeli aggression do not look at the events in an objective manner, but rather go to justify the Israeli mass killing of Palestinians by saying there would be casualties amongst civilians when attacking the Hamas fighters. However, they would not use such an assumption when it comes to the Al-Aqsa flood event of October 7th. And 10. We are confident that any fair and independent inquiries will prove the truth of our narrative and will prove the scale of lies and misleading information in the Israeli side. This also includes the Israeli allegations regarding the hospitals in Gaza, that the Palestinian resistance used them as command centres, an allegation that was not proven and was refuted by reports of many Western press agencies. So their plan was called Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, and it was a deliberate targeting of Israeli military sites. There are military garrisons in all of the kibbutzes surrounding Gaza, and indeed we know some of the hostages taken were soldiers, such as 2 of the 3 who were killed allegedly by poison gas attacks by Israel. Other hostages certainly were not hostages, though. Hostages were sought to exchange for those Israel is keeping imprisoned, a factor not covered nearly enough by our mainstream media. But Israel hold captive in their jails many more Palestinian hostages than Hamas holds Israeli ones. The Hannibal directives are there to prevent these deals, Israel preferring to kill their own people than release Palestinians they are holding themselves. And after Netanyahu kiboshed a cabinet-agreed negotiation for hostages with Hamas just last week, it again reinforces the ongoing belief that Netanyahu does not value Israeli lives. Israeli prisoners released have attested to being well looked after, as stated here as well, which cannot be said of Palestinian hostages released by Israel, who have made many claims of being abused while in captivity. Hamas, also unlike Israel, have held their hands up to having potentially made mistakes here. They don't directly admit them, but they do say that they're possible. Of course, independent investigation is required, and they welcome that. So this is not the response of a group seeking to absolve itself entirely of any fault here. We know there were Israeli helicopter attacks on people fleeing the Nova Music Festival. We've seen footage of that on social media. They mention the Israeli news outlets also corroborating that. And they talk about the ongoing examples that demonstrate an apparent indifference to the lives of Israeli hostages. The death toll of civilians in Gaza also speaks to an attitude of life being cheap, as long as they take a few Hamas operatives out as well. I could pick out more from this, but I'd rather you think about that and perhaps reread it or re-listen to it. You've seen the news stories covered. I've covered a lot of them, but there's scores that I haven't that are reflected in this statement too. But the thing that stood out most for me was that this was just a far more honest appraisal of what went down on what has happened since than anything Israel has actually issued. Any of their so-called evidence has proven so often haven't been completely debunked as a pack of lies. Now, I am not sitting here extolling the virtues of one side over the other. I am going to great lengths to try and avoid doing that, because innocent lives have been lost on both sides here. Who is to blame for what has to be investigated. A ceasefire is what we need to see. But the fact there is almost certainly guilt to one extent or another on both sides does not preclude the fact Gaza is occupied territory, or that those attacking it are the ones holding it under occupation and are now committing a genocide there. Those being genocided have every right to oppose that occupation. There is a definite question of scale of atrocity here, though, and that scale must be reflected in the consequences that follow these events when they eventually end, and they must end. Too much innocent life is still being lost. We need a ceasefire. We need leaders prepared to call for one, and we need a two-state solution whether Israel wants that or not, along with an end to their occupation of Palestine. All Netanyahu has right now is rhetoric, especially as we wait for the verdict due tomorrow from the International Court of Justice. And he's given out some mad speeches of late because of it. This one here is possibly his most insane, though. Watch it next and see if you think it's Israel or Hamas who sound the more warped, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so the International Court of Justice ruling yesterday elicited what can only be described as a, well, completely insane reaction on the part of Israel, really. And if you only heard Netanyahu's reaction, then you've not heard the worst of it. Whilst many commentators have looked at the orders and tried to work out whether a ceasefire was called or wasn't called, newsflash, not in so many words, but to all intents and purposes, yes, it pretty much was called, as I covered yesterday. And that really ought to be borne out by the dismissal of the ruling already. The accusations of anti-Semitism towards the ICJ, which were so obviously going to come, you could have set your watch by them. Not to mention outright dismissal, even trying to sell the ICJ verdict as a win for Israel, which it blatantly was not. Israel remain utterly incorrigible. Those supporting them still are left with a headache over it. No sympathy here for you. And in all likelihood, when the ICJ expects its report from Israel on how it has met these legally binding orders they have set down in 1 month's time, with this attitude, well, they're probably going to be looking at a blank sheet of paper, aren't they? So what are they going to do then? Right, so Israel's response to having lost so heavily at the ICJ to South Africa, prima facie level anyway, at first glance, has veered from angry outbursts to ardent dismissal to even trying to sell it as a win for themselves instead. The one thing no Israeli official has done that I've seen is just accept the verdict and act on it, though. It's not like the ICJ have demanded anything that cannot be seen as basic reasonable actions, though, but even they are more than many people expected. Mitigate the killing of civilians, protect them even. Therefore, a ceasefire in practice has actually been ordered. Since Israel cannot continue its indiscriminate bombardment of Gaza and its sniping of people waving white flags, it's been ordered to change its ways, change its tactics. Because they claim they cannot pick Hamas out from civilians, the order effectively demands Israel end what they're doing in accordance with what they themselves have said. It's all rather clever. But then, of course, aid must be allowed in, and basic services and infrastructure that Israel have destroyed must be restored by them as well. They destroyed it, they should fix it. Oh, and report back to the ICJ in 1 month to show what you've done. We want to see your homework. You'd think the ICJ had ordered them to peel their own eyeballs listening to some of them, though. Let's start with Netanyahu and what he said, because this is a guy whose only chance of staying out of jail pretty much depends on staying in power, and that depends on keeping these atrocities going to his mind, so he can't afford to stop now as a result. The ICJ ruling is causing him big problems personally, so naturally he's going to push back. He said, Israel's commitment to international law is unwavering. Equally unwavering is our sacred commitment to continue to defend our country and defend our people. Like every country, Israel has an inherent right to defend itself. The vile attempt to deny Israel this fundamental right is blatant discrimination against the Jewish state, and it was justly rejected. The charge of genocide levelled against Israel is not only false, it's outrageous, and decent people everywhere should reject it. On the eve of the Holocaust Remembrance Day, I again pledge as Israel's Prime Minister, never again. Israel will continue to defend itself against Hamas, a genocidal terror organisation. On October 7th, Hamas perpetrated the most horrific atrocities against the Jewish people since the Holocaust, and it vows to repeat these atrocities again and again and again. Our war is against Hamas terrorists, not against Palestinian civilians. We will continue to facilitate humanitarian assistance and to do our utmost to keep civilians out of harm's way, even as Hamas uses civilians as human shields. We will continue to do what is necessary to defend our country and defend our people. Yes, he gave that broadcast yesterday because today, as this video goes out, 27th of January, is Holocaust Remembrance Day, as the world collectively vows to remember the Holocaust and say, never again. But it's literally happening in front of our eyes, and the International Court of Justice says there is a case to investigate. So never again, coming from you, BB, is what is actually outrageous, not the verdict they handed down at this early stage. The terms of prima facie have been met under the Genocide Convention, so genocide accusations are entirely appropriate right now. The deaths caused on October 7th must be investigated too, since so many of the deaths have, as eyewitnesses have attested to, been by Israeli hands and not by Hamas hands. Hamas issued a grossly underreported statement, which I covered the other day, saying their intent on October 7th was to secure military hostages for hostage exchanges. Because for all of Netanyahu's claims of not having issues with Palestinian civilians, many more are locked up in Israeli jails than Hamas hold Israelis. Hostage exchanges have gone on for decades. It is the reason Israel have the existence of these Hannibal directives, because that is to negate these exchanges by the Israeli forces. It is Israeli forces killing their own people before they can be taken hostage. It is barbaric. It was supposedly stopped in 2016, yet witness after witness still bring them up as active orders being carried out to this day, Israeli witnesses. Your commitment to international law isn't unwavering, it's non-existent in light of this response to that ICJ ruling. But his response was actually the even-handed one. His security minister, let's turn to him, the hard right and completely off his gourd, Itamar Ben-Gvir, a guy who is in government because, well, Netanyahu gave him his own police force in effect to oversee, because that's not at all too creepy, is it? But it put Bibi back in power, which is all that really mattered, and he responded to the ICJ verdict by tweeting out, "Haig Schmeig." Sure, that's unwavering support for international law, isn't it? Ben-Gvir went further, though. The Times of Israel reported him as having said, "The decision of the anti-Semitic court in The Hague proves what was already known. This court does not seek justice, but rather the persecution of Jewish people. They were silent during the Holocaust, and today they continue the hypocrisy and take it another step further. Decisions that endanger the continued existence of the State of Israel must not be listened to. We must continue defeating the enemy until complete victory." Holocaust Remembrance Day. Remember, that's today. We remember the Holocaust, which was conducted between 1941 and 1945. And if Ben-Gvir, to get over his rabid responses and engage his brain for 2 seconds, was capable of any such thing, the fact he's attacked the ICJ for having been silent during the Holocaust might have a lot to do with the fact they didn't exist at that point. They weren't founded until 1945, at the end of it, and they didn't actually begin work as the rest of the United Nations were still being set up until April of 1946. The Holocaust was over. The ICJ was literally founded off the back of that atrocity, which should never be forgotten, which should be a never again moment. But sadly is very much appearing to not be the case, and we have to call that out as we bear witness to it now. Oh, and of course he played the anti-Semitism card, didn't he? Because someone was bound to, weren't they? Ben-Gvir, for all of his faux outrage here, was literally calling for a voluntary migration plan for all Palestinians in Gaza as recently as the 19th of this month. That's ethnic cleansing. That's a war crime. That's a human rights violation. That is not leaving Palestinian civilians alone, as Netanyahu claimed last night. But contrary to both their opinions has been the besuited smarmy opinion sought by the mainstream media of a guy who appears to be the new Israeli apologist of choice for the mainstream media, Elon Levy, an Israeli government spokesperson. He went on to Murdoch Radio, Times Radio, speaking to Aisha Hazarika, and said, "This was a sick stunt, unfortunately, by South Africa, to try to take the victims of genocide and cast that allegation against them. South Africa brought a case against Israel seeking to force it to suspend its military action against Hamas and abandon the hostages while leaving Hamas free to re-offend, and the court was wise to throw that out and reaffirmed that Israel has an inherent and natural right to defend its people and bring back the hostages, who, by the way, the court called for their immediate and unconditional release." Thing is, the case wasn't thrown out. There's merit to it, and they're going to carry this case forward. Prima facie was proven. To all intents and purposes, the order put upon Israel do call for a ceasefire, because it is impossible for them to carry on as they have been, with the level of civilian deaths, which are grossly excessive. As for self-defence, Israel's been razing Gaza to the ground for 3 months, off the back of one incursion on one night by Hamas to grab hostages. And I'll admit, that is their version of events and absolutely should be investigated too. But your self-defence argument is out of the window, especially when you consider, it should not be forgotten, that this is 56-year-long occupied territory, occupied people who in Gaza specifically have been under blockade as well since 2007. Your self-defence is against a captive population who you yourselves are holding captive. They have an entitlement under international law to resist that. So regardless of what you think of Hamas or anyone else in the Gaza Strip and what they themselves have done and do and will continue to do, that's a basic tenet that underlies everything and must always be taken into consideration. So we have the Israeli PM, a government spokesperson, and the Security Minister of Israel, all taking different views on the ICJ verdict, from dismissal to insult to varying views even on what the ruling yesterday meant. Israel is in disarray behind the scenes based on this. But the one thing I think they all agree on is that this won't stop. They will just carry on, and some form of escalation of sanctions further down the line by the ICJ, as Israel certainly will violate these orders given, seem likely. Enforcing them, however, may be another matter. It's not for the court to do that, it's for the Security Council. The US have their pesky veto, though it's going to be a lot worse a look on them if they choose to exercise it following these rulings by the ICJ. And whilst Hamas are not on trial here, another factor Israel seemed to keep missing, by the way, the media missed the fact that Hamas had issued their own statement based on the night of October 7th, which if you want to know what their opinion actually is, since nobody seems interested in asking 3 months on, well, I've covered it here. You should probably watch it next, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.